You know Dasher and Dancer and Prancer and Vixen, Comet and Cupid and Donner and Nixon, but do you recall that Santa Claus also has a wife who deserves more respect and appreciation? Today we are talking about Mrs. Claus. Welcome to Teacup for One. My name is Matt and I have 2 degrees, and that's right everyone, today we are talking about the often overlooked First Lady of Christmas, a character who was once a footnote in history that has gone on to serve as a feminist icon and an anti-feminist icon. A character portrayed by the likes of Miranda Richardson, Angela Lansbury, Goldie Hawn, a character who was the surprise hit of the 2023 Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. That's right everyone, today is all about Mrs. Claus. Chances are everybody watching this video has some passing knowledge of Mrs. Claus. I mean, as far as I know, she's always been a part of Santa's operation up there in the North Pole, and if you're under the age of 40, you probably grew up with her in a slew of your favorite TV Christmas specials. But she's an interesting character, because as far as Christmas characters go, she's actually one of the younger ones. For context, Mrs. Claus is younger than Scrooge. I mean, not this Scrooge, Michael Caine specifically, but like younger than the character of Ebenezer Scrooge. And it's hard to believe, because I always think of Santa and Mrs. Claus as being a unit, but at the same time, it's unsurprising when you consider that Santa has been around in some capacity for well over 1,000 years. Granted, he wasn't always Santa, but also, we're not turning this into the evolution of Santa Claus, because that would take far too long, and this video alone took like almost a month for me to research. And then I recorded it once and the sound didn't work, so what you're seeing is the second pass at it. Where were we? So you'll just have to trust me when I say that by the mid-1800s, Santa Claus, as we know him today, had been firmly established. Honestly, the 1800s, that is when Santa reached his peak form. That is when Santa finally evolved into his final Pokemon form of Santa Claus. Is that how Pokemon works? I don't know. But the 1800s, that's when he got the reindeer. The 1800s, that's when Washington Irving, author of Sleepy Hollow, decided, hey, you know how Santa breaks and enters into homes? He slides down the chimney. And the 1800s is also when Mrs. Claus first came into being. But what's really interesting about Mrs. Claus is that she took her time to make an entrance. I mean, unlike Santa's reindeer, for example, who just showed up in the night before Christmas and then were instantly a part of the Christmas canon, the idea of Mrs. Claus was thrown around for decades before she was actually included in anything as a proper character. Basically, we had almost 40 years of people talking about her before she actually showed up at the party, and that is a power move. The first ever mention of Mrs. Claus came in the 1849 short story A Christmas Legend, which was about a poverty-stricken family on Christmas Eve. And the family is depressed because they're poverty-stricken, and they're also depressed because their oldest daughter died years and years prior. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, an old man and an old woman knock on their door, seeking shelter from the bitter cold in exchange for a rose for shelter. The rose for shelter, I just saw an opportunity for a Beauty and the Beast reference and I took it, but so no rose, but yeah, an old man and an old woman show up at the door and they're like, it's cold, the nearest hotel is miles away, can we stay here for the night? The family welcomes them with open arms. The next morning, the family wakes up and lo and behold, their living space is filled to the brim with presents, and then they think, oh my gosh, that old man and his wife must have been Kris Kringle and his wife, right? Right? Well, that would actually be more believable than the ending of the story. The true ending of the story is this M. Night Shyamalan twist that the old man and old woman were actually a young man and a young woman, and the young woman is the long-lost, thought-to-be-dead daughter of this family, and her showing up dressed as, I guess, Mrs. Claus was her way of saying, surprise family, Merry Christmas, I'm actually alive. Maybe the story went into detail to explain why she thought that was the best way to reunite with her family. I don't know. When I found out she wasn't Mrs. Claus, I stopped reading. So even though that story may not be the best, it is still crucial in Mrs. Claus history, and it's the short story that you're always going to see cited as the first introduction of Mrs. Claus, which I guess is accurate because it was the first time somebody posited the idea that Kris Kringle could actually have a wife. 5 years later, Mrs. Claus made a cameo appearance in a Christmas pageant at the Utica Psychiatric Center, then called the New York State Lunatic Asylum, and the records don't tell us much about this appearance, aside from saying that she showed up, she was holding the baby, she did a dance to a Christmas song, and that was it. So that was likely the first ever public appearance of some form of Mrs. Claus, but honestly, it sounds like this was more of a cabaret act than anything else. And they don't actually tell us what she was wearing. What I told you is essentially what we know. She showed up with a baby, did a dance, and left. The first time somebody decided to describe Mrs. Claus's fit, which Urban Dictionary tells me means outfit, according to the Gen Z kids, was in an 1864 comedy novel called The Metropolites. This did include a detailed description of what she was wearing, which included like tall, hunter-style boots, a red dress, and a bonnet. And I mean, this isn't too far off from how we still depict Mrs. Claus today, but I think it's important to note that in this short story, Mrs. Claus's appearance was a part of a dream sequence. So, to recap, since the first ever mention of Mrs. Claus, we've seen her show up as a disguise for a long-lost, thought-to-be-dead daughter. We've had her show up as a cabaret act. We've had her show up as part of a dream sequence. But, so far as I can tell, by the 1860s, Mrs. Claus had still not appeared in anything as a proper character. And to clarify, when I say proper character, I mean somebody who isn't in a costume, somebody who isn't the byproduct of another character's dream, just someone who can walk into a room and exist as Mrs. Claus. I mean, The Night Before Christmas came out in the 1820s, and that was an entire poem just about Santa walking into a room and existing as Santa. I mean, why is it taking so long for Mrs. Claus to get the same respect? So that begs the question. What was the first instance of Mrs. Claus appearing in something as a proper character? And the answer? I don't know. Okay, I think I know. I don't know for sure. I think I know, and I hope I'm wrong. Listen, this is the thing about Mrs. Claus literature, okay? If you go looking for it, there is a lot of it, especially from the late 1800s, but like, it is tough to find. You can find references to it, but it's really hard to find the actual text, and so suffice it to say, the earliest piece I could find that seems to be a true Mrs. Claus story is called Mrs. Santa Claus's Adventure by Charles S. Dickinson. Not to be confused with Charles Dickens. That is very important. This is Charles S. Dickinson, not Charles Dickens. And it's from a period of time where the trend seemed to be weaponizing Mrs. Claus as a character to make a political statement. And, like, listen, I just feel like Mrs. Claus deserved a better introduction to the world than this story. Mrs. Santa Claus's Adventure was a short story that appeared in Wood's Household magazine in 1871. I couldn't find the original text to read it, but based on essays that I read, this is roughly what it's about. Mrs. Claus disagrees with Santa on his policy with regard to naughty children. I'm assuming her perspective is, there's good in everybody, let's give gifts to the naughty kids. And Santa's like, no, I have a system, and it works. Naughty kids don't get presents. So Santa goes off to do his toy delivering to the kids who are worthy. And then Mrs. Claus decides, you know what? I'm going to give presents to those naughty children. And then she does. But then when she slides down the chimney to give gifts to the bad kids, she's attacked by monsters. She's attacked by, like, evil imp-like creatures that are the physical manifestations of the kids' naughtiness. And so this story was basically just like a thinly veiled anti-suffragette piece to show women what would happen if they disobeyed their husbands and left the safety and the security of the home. They'd be attacked by monsters. But you know what? Even if that is the first Mrs. Claus story, in some ways it is kind of perfect because it hits on two key elements that tend to show up a lot in subsequent Mrs. Claus writing. The first is this what-if story. What if Mrs. Claus goes out on her own on Christmas Eve? And it surprised me how often that actually came up as a plot device, but when you think about it, of course, that is the go-to Mrs. Claus story, because what better Mrs. Claus story could there be? This is the stay-at-home wife of the most important man in the world. Of course, we want to know what's going to happen, like that one Christmas when she decides to take the reins on her own. And tied in with that narrative is the second thing, using Mrs. Claus to make a comment or a statement in one way or another about a woman's role in society. Because again, this is the stay-at-home wife of the most important man in the world. Inevitably, everyone is going to have an opinion of her, especially when you consider that Mrs. Claus showed up around the time of the dawn of the US suffrage movement. Or maybe she showed up because of the dawn of the US suffrage movement. So, unsurprisingly, Charles Dick Inson's short story was not the only one to make an example of Mrs. Claus. There was another short story published in 1879 written by M.B. Horton called A New Departure. And listen, I don't want to give a shred of credit to a piece of anti-suffragette writing, but that title is hilarious and so unapologetically aggressive. So yeah, A New Departure. The story is about Mrs. Claus literally departing the North Pole on her own to take the gift giving into her own hands. So yes, it is literally a narrative about a new departure. But a new departure was also a term coined by the US Democratic Party in the 1870s, which was also adopted by early suffragettes. So it's likely that people reading this story at the time, not even likely, it's guaranteed that everyone reading this story at the time would have had the context to understand that they were reading a very thinly veiled, tongue-in-cheek statement on the new departure strategy. And even if that went over their head, the story outright opens with, "This story is a comment on the new departure strategy." So, not subtle. Oh my god. And this story, it was so clearly written by somebody who would probably work for Fox News today. It opens with Mrs. Claus crashing a family's Christmas party. She is wearing a hat that says women's rights, and she introduces herself essentially saying, "Hello, I'm a suffragette first and Mrs. Claus second. I don't care for my husband, I can do the job. Here, enjoy some presents." But lo and behold, all of the presents are awful. One of them is literally just a turnip. It's a turnip that has a watch face drawn on it. And then she's like, "Here's a pocket watch, but it's a turnip." And then the family flips out on her. I'm just going to read you an excerpt from the story right now. "Well, what is this? Am I to be made a fool of by this idiot woman? What do you mean by this humbugging presentation of Christmas gifts? Not a word from the new departure. Would that she had left things to the old." And then Santa Claus shows up, like a superhero, and reveals that he knew Mrs. Claus was up to something tricky, so he planted a bag of decoy awful gifts, knowing that she would grab it and ultimately humiliate herself. It's like a really chauvinistic episode of I Love Lucy, which is actually saying a lot. And then he goes on to say that no matter how good-looking Mrs. Claus is, and no matter how well-dressed she is, the job of Santa has been the job of Santa for over 1800 years, and you can't just go changing that. So of these two Mrs. Claus stories, we have one that's warning women that if they go out on their own, they will be attacked by monsters of the id.
Monsters from the id.
That's another one that's warning women that if they try to do a man's job, they will ultimately end up being humiliated. Now, I can't say for sure because M.B. Horton could be anybody, but I'm fairly confident that both of these short stories were written by men. But what happens when you look at the Mrs. Claus stories written around the same time by women? Well, a lot of the pieces written by women were actually written in the first person, which means that Mrs. Claus was getting a voice of her own for the first time. Sarah J. Burke's Mrs. Santa Claus Asserts Herself is a great example. It is a beautiful, albeit extremely depressing poem written in the first person, expressing how Mrs. Claus cares for Santa, how she works her fingers to the bone for him, and how on Christmas Eve, he leaves her alone, goes out, and gets all of the love and all of the praise. And then it ends with a call to action for all the women reading this poem who Mrs. Claus assumes is far better off than she is, with the sad irony being that every woman reading this at the time was probably in the exact same position. But I think the most important piece of Mrs. Claus writing came in 1889 from author from author Catherine Lee Bates, aka the woman who wrote the lyrics to America the Beautiful. Bates wrote a poem called Goody Santa Claus on a Sleigh Ride, which, once again, was about Mrs. Claus calling out Santa for not letting her have any fun on Christmas Eve, which eventually leads to her riding on the sleigh and doing some gift giving of her own.
Hey, I've seen this one.
Sound familiar? But the big difference here is that in this story, Mrs. Claus is actually traveling alongside Santa. This is one of the first times we're seeing Santa and Mrs. Claus work together as a unit and not in opposition to each other. They aren't enemies, which those earlier pieces would have you believe. In this story, they are a happily married couple. We get a real sense of their relationship. Mrs. Claus even speaks about their wedding day, and not only does she want to go on the sleigh ride, like for the adventure of it all, But it's also because she wants to get cozy with Santa. She wants to have a romantic date night with her husband. And yes, they have some disagreements, and yes, Santa is hesitant about Mrs. Claus delivering some gifts, and he even says, "No, dear, let me do it," and then she does for like the first 2 or 3 houses, but then towards the end of the evening, she gets to go down the chimney, she fills some kid's stocking, she goes back up the chimney, and Christmas continues. The world keeps turning because there is enough gift giving to be done by more than one person. It is a really sweet story, and I think what I appreciate about it is that it is a family-friendly story. Yes, there is very clear subtext that makes an important point about gender roles, but at the end of the day, it is still a family-friendly story about Mrs. Claus that isn't just propaganda written by adults for adults to make a point. And I feel like this story is the first time we're really seeing the traits that would go on to define Mrs. Claus into the 20th century, defining her as someone who supports Santa as a partner, because she is just as passionate about Christmas as he is. And this brings us into a new century, the 20th century. It's a Return to Oz quote for those who don't know. Okay, and look, once again, there was evidently a lot of stuff written about Mrs. Claus in the early 20th century, but once again, it is really difficult to find. I found reference to a one-act play that's apparently a comedy. It sounds absolutely delightful. I don't know what it was about. In the 20s, there was a book called The Great Adventures of Mrs. Santa Claus. The only copy I could find is on eBay for $800. And like, if I was writing an actual thesis on Mrs. Claus, maybe I would drop that money so I could tell you what it was about, but I'm not. This is a YouTube video that like maybe 100 people are gonna watch. So just believe me when I say that there was Mrs. Claus writing. It existed. But right now we're going to fast forward 75 years. We're going to gloss over 2 world wars. We're going to gloss over women getting the vote. We're going to gloss over a ton of other stuff to bring us to 1964. The first time Mrs. Claus appeared on the silver screen. That is right. We have just entered Mrs. Claus's movie star era. You know what's interesting? When it comes to movies, history pretty well just repeated itself. By the 1960s, Santa had already been on screen for well over 50 years. By the 1960s, Santa Claus was an Academy Award-winning role. Shout out to Edmund Gwen Miracle on 34th Street, we love you. But, just like in the 1800s, it took Mrs. Claus decades before she actually appeared in the mainstream media alongside her husband. Now, can anyone guess what Mrs. Claus's first on-screen appearance was? I'll give you 3 seconds. Okay, time's up. It was Santa Claus versus the Martians, which is just so random, yet so perfect. A bit more notable than that, in the same year she also appeared on screen in the Rankin Bass stop-motion classic Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, where she famously body shames Santa for being skinny, where she's like, "Who wants a skinny Santa Claus? Eat! Eat!" And she calls him Papa and he calls her Mama, which is kind of weird in a Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf sort of way, and I don't know how I feel about that. Both of these portrayals seem to play into the stereotype of the nagging wife, which like isn't great. But honestly, it's better than using Mrs. Claus to tell women why they don't deserve the vote, so progress is progress. But what's really fun about Mrs. Claus's portrayals in the 20th century is that now we were dealing with generations of storytellers who had grown up with a consciousness of Mrs. Claus. Like, she was finally a part of Christmas mythology. People like Nat King Cole were singing her praises. Literally. We had writers starting to move beyond pieces that were just acknowledging she existed, and we started to get things like Mrs. Claus origin stories, which brings us to what I personally believe is the best Mrs. Claus film to date, the 1970 Rankin Bass Christmas special, Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Jessica is hashtag my Mrs. Claus. I remember watching this Christmas special in school and loving it then. I just revisited it while I was doing research for this video. It is such a beautiful film and such a great origin story for Mrs. Claus. Jessica starts out as an uptight school teacher who loves her students but is concerned for their safety under the weird dictatorship of the mayor of Sombertown, who for some reason has outlawed toys. Even though she butts heads with Kris Kringle at first, eventually she comes around and starts to see value in his work and goes on to become his #1 ally. Eventually they fall in love, they get married on Christmas Eve, and she grows into the Mrs. Claus that we have all come to know, recognize, and love. Truthfully, I don't think there is any better Mrs. Claus origin story than this. Yes, Mrs. Claus does have a tricky history with being portrayed as cold, abrasive, or a nag, so at first glance, introducing her as an uptight, super strict school teacher might feel like we're reverting back to some of those old tropes, but I don't think that's the case. Listen, Opposites attract, and balance is required in every relationship. So when you consider that Santa Claus is a traditionally jolly person, like a fun-loving, free spirit, I think it makes a ton of sense that he would have a partner who would keep him grounded. And the school teacher element is crucial, because if you have a school teacher, to me, that implies a rule follower who also has an affection and a love for children. I mean, what better partner could there be for Santa? It is such a good setup that Disney outright stole it for their second film in the Santa Claus franchise, the Santa Claus 2.
It's Mrs. Claus.
Yeah, in that movie, Santa Claus, Scott Calvin, needs to find a wife. And who does he go for? Not the super enthusiastic Christmas fan played by Molly Shannon, who, might I just say, she deserved way better treatment. It is not a crime to sing a song about reindeer in a restaurant. That took a lot of vulnerability, and I respect her for it. But no, Scott Calvin went for his son's principal, played by Elizabeth Mitchell from Lost. And you know what? With the Santa Clauses series on Disney+, I suspect that Elizabeth Mitchell probably has the most on-screen time as Mrs. Claus compared to any other actor. And I think she is a great Mrs. Claus. But, for my money, there is one definitive on-screen portrayal of Mrs. Claus, and that is the one, the only, the legend, Angela Lansbury. That's right! Freaking Mrs. Potts played Mrs. Claus. What better Mrs. Claus casting could there be? So this was in 1996. In 1996, Angela Lansbury played the title role in a made-for-TV movie musical called Mrs. Santa Claus. This was a musical with songs written by Jerry Herman. Jerry Herman is a famous Broadway composer who did things like Hello Dolly, La Cage aux Folles, and Mame. Yeah, which means this is the guy who wrote We Need a Little Christmas right this very minute, candles in the window, carols at the spinet. Like, that is the ultimate get pumped Christmas song, and nothing in Mrs. Santa Claus really holds a candle to that number. But you know what? We can't blame Jerry Herman for that. You cannot capture lightning in a bottle twice. What makes this movie so good, aside from the music and aside from Angela Lansbury, is that it really captures the history of Mrs. Claus in more ways than one. It's using the classic story from like all those short stories I talked about from the 1800s. This takes place in 1910. Mrs. Claus feels unappreciated and undervalued by Santa, and so she takes it upon herself to take the sleigh out 1 week before Christmas so that she can test out a new route that she feels is going to be more efficient for Santa on Christmas Eve. However, she ends up crash landing in New York City. One of the reindeers sustains a bit of an injury, and the vet that she finds says it's going to take a week for him to heal up. So during that week, she mixes and mingles with the people of New York. She makes friends with a suffragette and the suffragette's family. She brings like two unlikely lovebirds together. And she ends up leading a group of children in a workers' revolt against an evil toy maker, played by Terrence Mann, aka the Beast in the original Broadway cast of Beauty and the Beast. It is so good. This whole musical is basically Newsies at Christmas with Angela Lansbury. And it is so cool to see an entire film about Mrs. Claus that has such strong ties to the social struggles that originally defined her as a character. Sadly, not many people know this movie exists, but I personally hope it gets a resurgence one day, or, even better, a proper on-stage adaptation, because this material would honestly kill at regional theaters. And then they should all cast me as the evil toy maker. Alright, we have discussed Mrs. Claus in literature, we have discussed Mrs. Claus in movies, but there is still the final frontier. Mrs. Claus, live and in person. We've all seen Santa in a mall. Maybe some of us have even met Santa in a mall, but let me ask you this. When was the last time you had an opportunity to meet Mrs. Claus in a mall? Probably never. So that's why I was shocked to discover that the history of Mrs. Claus performers actually goes back almost as far as the history of Santa Claus performers. Yeah, unlike the books and the movies, this is something Mrs. Claus started doing almost at the same time as her husband. Macy's started using Santa performers as early as 1861, but it wasn't until the 1890s that the idea really took off, and Santas started showing up in department stores all over North America. And it only took until 1907 for the first Mrs. Claus performer to make an appearance in a department store. It was in Filene's in Boston. They hired a Mrs. Claus performer alongside a Santa to help entertain the kids. And in 1937, Charles Howard opened up the first ever Santa Claus school, which, fun fact, This school is still in existence today. And when he opened up the school, he announced that he was going to be taking 2 women into his program to teach them how to be Mrs. Claus. To, and I quote, "greet little girls, learn what they want in their Christmas stockings, teach them how to play with dolls, doll houses, dishes, and clothes." He also went on to say that the 2 women he hired would have to be very good looking. Again, not great, but it's the 1930s, and it's still better than a new departure. It sounds like he was bringing women into the program because there was likely a high demand for Santa Claus performers, more so than there were actual male performers that could appropriately and adequately play Santa. So I guess the logic was, well, it's better to have a female here representing the North Pole as Mrs. Claus than there is to not meet the demand for Santas, which actually foreshadowed something that happened just a few years later, because just a few years later, female Santa Clauses were all over the place. When World War II started, a ton of men went off to fight, leaving women behind to take over roles, jobs, and positions that were usually filled by men. And yes, this included Santa Claus. Women would put on the beard, the hat, the suit, and they'd talk to kids as Santa and find out what they wanted for Christmas. And yeah, people reacted to a female Santa the way you would expect them to. Kind of the same way everyone acted in 2023 when they suddenly became experts on what mermaids look like. Half the population were upset and claimed that a female Santa would ruin the experience for the kids, while the other half figured that a woman dressed as Santa was better than the kids getting no Santa at all. But there is one particular lady Santa that I want to draw attention to. It's 1943. And Daisy Belmore, an English film and stage actress who had uncredited roles in All Quiet on the Western Front and Dracula, was hired by Saks Fifth Avenue to put on the red suit and be their resident Claus. But she didn't wear the beard. She put on the suit, she identified herself to the kids as Mrs. Santa Claus, said she was filling in for her husband, and much like Angela Bassett, she did the thing. She listened to the kids' gift requests, and by all accounts, they had no problem telling her what they wanted for Christmas. Now, this was a woman who had over 20 Broadway credits to her name, but she said that playing Mrs. Santa Claus was one of the most amusing roles in her entire career. She talked about how all the little girls were asking for dolls, all the little boys were asking for medical kits, and then there was one 7-year-old girl who asked her for a machine gun, which honestly just goes to show that even back then, boy toys and girl toys never existed. Although the 7-year-old wanting a machine gun is kind of a different issue. But the reason I wanted to draw attention to her is because this appears to be an early and a rare example of a Mrs. Claus solo act. And that is something that we still do not see all that often to this day. However, the Christmas performer community has started to move in that direction. In 2016, the International Federation of Real Bearded Santas voted to allow Mrs. Claus performers to join the organization as solo members. And I mean, this was a big deal. I don't know how much you know about these Santa Claus unions, organizations, and groups, but they are very specific about who they will allow to join. Their whole thing is upholding a very specific image of a very specific Santa Claus. So this was one of the first times ever that an organization like this was including another Christmas character in the mix. And around the same time, the Santa Nana University was founded, and that is a much more inclusive program that's geared towards female Christmas performers, but open to absolutely anybody. Their curriculum covers things like Christmas history, character development, personal marketing for Christmas performers, and so much more. So, suffice it to say, Mrs. Claus has begun to gain more of a presence in the world of Christmas performers over the past 2 decades or so. Even now, at Winterfest at Canada's Wonderland, they have an event where you can decorate cookies with Mrs. Claus, which I'm fairly certain is the first time I've personally had access to a Mrs. Claus-focused event, like Without Santa, where Mrs. Claus is the star. Unfortunately, statistics show that Mrs. Claus performers are still underpaid compared to their Santa counterparts. Now, will that change anytime soon? I hope so. And I do think it's possible. I think Mrs. Claus has come a long way in the past 150 years, and I think she still has a long way to go. I mean, just look at how excited everyone was this year when Sheryl Lee Ralph appeared as Mrs. Claus at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. That cameo appearance was one of the most talked about moments of the entire parade, and I would go as far as to say that she outshone Santa. It was notable for a ton of reasons. First of all, it was the first time that the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade featured a black Mrs. Claus. It was also the first time that they had a celebrity playing Mrs. Claus. So obviously that does a ton for representation, but I think it's also interesting because maybe it's the start of a new tradition? Like, I'm wondering if Macy's is going to keep this going, having a different female celebrity take on the role of Mrs. Claus in every year's parade. And having a celebrity in the role, like Sheryl Lee Ralph, is kind of perfect, because it gives the opportunity to have a notable female icon stand in the parade, being seen by hundreds of thousands, if not maybe millions, of people, representing everything that Mrs. Claus has stood for since the beginning. Empowerment, independence, care, support. So all in all, I think it's fair to say that Mrs. Claus is still evolving and will continue to evolve for every Christmas to come. And I feel like she's always been a mirror to how any given generation has seen and valued women, both as partners and as individuals. So it's up to us to see what she becomes. That sounded deep. And with that, friends, this concludes yet another episode of Teacup for One. Now let me know in the comment section down below, what is your favorite portrayal of Mrs. Claus? And if you want to be the first to know when I release more videos about Christmas, Disney, Shakespeare, cats, Funko Pops, make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed already. And if you haven't subscribed already, it is so easy. All you have to do is click on my face. Thanks for joining me today, everyone. My name is Matt, and I have 2 degrees, and that's the Teacup for One. Go away.